Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. If you haven't told your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess, I really would appreciate it. That's the best way to get the word out. Okay, today I'm going to talk about space. And the articles I've written in the past are called something like Space is a Means to an Ends, and we'll talk about that in a minute. First, let's define what space is. One very rough way to define space on a chessboard is the distances that your pawns are from where they started. So if you play a pawn up to e4, that gives you an extra 2 spaces along the e file. And if you have a pawn chain or pawns connected up the board, then they create space behind them that your pieces can move in. So the space in general would be the distance up to your pawns on the board. If the pawns are all traded in an endgame, let's say you're in an endgame with a king, a rook, and a knight against a king, a bishop, and a knight, and there's no pawns on the board, then there's really no concept of space. All the other pieces on the board except for pawns don't care which direction they're moving. They can use the whole board one direction or another. Of the 6 different types of pieces on the board, pawns are the only ones that really care where you started, where you're sitting. Once they're all off the board, you could spin the board around. It doesn't matter which direction you're going. So pawns provide not only direction, but they also provide the space within that direction. Okay, so that's a general idea of what space is. Why do I say space is means to an ends? Well, when I did a video and I wrote my articles and I included in my books the ideas of evaluating a chess position, I included 4 criteria. The criteria are pretty well known. The first one is material, which almost everybody uses. They say, I'm up a knight, I'm down a knight, I'm down a queen for a rook, whatever. Material is number 1. King safety is number 1A or number 2. If your king is unsafe, you may be up in material, but you may be getting checkmated. Number 3 is the activity of your army. If your army's doing a lot, then that makes your position stronger, so that greatly affects the evaluation. When they asked world champion Garry Kasparov how important peace activity in chess, he said something to the effect of, chess is peace activity. And if you play over Gary's games, you often see him sacrificing a small amount of material like a pawn or the exchange so that he can get his army to have a lot more activity than the opponent's army. So sometimes you can trade off some material for getting extra activity. A good example of that also is a gambit in the opening where you sacrifice a pawn so you can get extra tempos to get more pieces out. So you're trading off material for activity. The last criteria, which is probably the least important, but it's still very important, that's why it's on the list, is pawn structure. So if you have a better pawn structure, that helps you with the evaluation. If you have a position where you have a lot more activity than your opponent, but you have an inferior pawn structure, you're almost always way better off than you're much better unless you trade a whole bunch of pieces and all of a sudden all your activity goes away and then you're just left with the bad pawn structure. So the 4, again, are material, pawn structure, king safety, and peace activity, not necessarily, of course, in that order. Okay, why didn't I put space on there? Sometimes people say, well, what about space? And then I answer them, well, space is a means to an end. The whole idea of space is to give your pieces more activity than the opponent's pieces because they have more space they can move around. And space means mobility. Mobility means moves, how many moves a piece can make. Activity is more subjective than mobility. Activity is what a piece can do. But again, if your pawns give you space, then usually your pieces have more activity. And I like to give an example of this with what I call an ad absurdum example, a ridiculous position where one side has a lot more space and a lot more activity and mobility than others. And that's the one you see in front of you right now. In this position, white's pawns are all up in the 4th, 5th, and 6th ranks. Black's pawns are stuck on the 7th, 6th, and 5th ranks. And you can see that white has a lot more space than black does. And I've given white the complete control over that space by centralizing his pieces and sticking black's pieces in the corner. In fact, I could have made it even worse. I could have put the black bishops along the A and H files instead of, let's say, the knights. And that would be even worse because right now the black bishops they may not have a lot of activity, but at least they have a lot of mobility. But obviously white's position is quite overwhelming. If we turn on the engine and it's white's move, the engine says we have checkmate in 3 with something like bishop takes, check, king takes, queen checks, bishop in the way, queen takes, bishop, checkmate. And that's not the only checkmate we have. It says we could do nothing and checkmate in 4. It says we could just play queen to f2, threatening the sneaky pin, queen takes g6 check, if I can draw a line far enough to all the way up there. All right, Mr. Line, well, you get the idea. It's queen takes b6 check. There we go, b6. Anyway, so white is completely winning. And this is a silly example. You'll never get a position that's this good in a chess game unless you're playing someone who's an absolute beginner who doesn't know how to get out their pieces and sticks their pieces behind pawns that are stuck. And you'll get this position. You might say, well, Dan, isn't this a good example of where space is always a criteria, and it's a really good criteria in white's advantage here? Well, that's true, but the problem is we could use the exact same pawn structure and get the exact opposite result. And I made an example of that too. Let me click on that. Here we go. All right, now in this position, white has the exact same pawn structure compared to black. But now we've allowed black's pieces to get around the white pawns so that the white pawns can't challenge the squares they go to. One of the things you're trying to do in chess is to take away your opponent's squares. And a lot of times you do that by the potential of pawns attacking them, because if you AWL a piece, if you attack with something worth less, let's say you attack a piece with a pawn, then usually the piece has to move away. But here the white pawns are helpless to do that, and black's gotten around all those pawns. And now, even if it's white's move, you can see that black is dominating the board because the pieces have gotten around. And in this case, the space is disastrous for white because the black pieces have managed to get around those pawns. And if we turn on the engine, it says if white plays perfectly, he's only getting mated in 4. Well, now he's getting mated in 9 moves, according to the engine, even if it's his move. So you can see that in this case, the space has backfired and he's gotten around it. This example is also a good example of why you don't start the game by pushing all 8 of your pawns just down the board. We once had a player at our mainline chess club who I called the mad pawn pusher, and he did stuff like that. He would push all his pawns in the opening, or maybe 6 or 7 of the 8, and he pushed them all down the board, and he would scare all the really low-rated players and knock them off the board by doing that. But when he played people who were much higher rated, like 15, 16, 1700, they would kind of laugh at him and poke holes in his pawn structure with pawn breaks. And he'd be left with an exposed king, and his opponent's pieces would get strung. Not as bad as in this example, of course, but it's the same kind of thing. And he would lose a lot of games, and they would tell him, well, you know, it was okay to push 3 or 4 of those pawns, but when you push 6 or 7 right away and neglect the rest of your development, then, you know, you're allowing your opponent to, you know, strategically use their pawns to break up their pawns and get their pieces around the pawns like this. So the mad pawn pusher eventually gave up madly pushing pawns, but unfortunately then he got overly conservative and started losing to the lower players when he didn't want to push any of his pawns and he didn't get enough space. So he needed something in between that would be much better. Okay, so that's why I say space is a means to an end. In this second example, white has the pieces that are not as well active and coordinated, and black's the one who has the active and coordinated army around the white pawns. So if space doesn't give you the advantage of mobility and activity, then space is relatively useless. I should also mention there's a third reason for space besides mobility and activity of your pieces, and that is in the endgame, sometimes if you have more space, your pawns are closer to queening, which means either you can use your pawns to threaten the queen to win material, or you might be able to do sacrificial combinations where you sacrifice pieces for your opponent's pawns to get some pawns out of the way and allow your pawns to promote. So having more space in the endgame is often very helpful. Now, when is a space not helpful in the endgame? Well, let's say you're in an endgame where you have a passed pawn and you push it all the way up the board and your opponent has a king and a rook blocking it, and your king is far away from that pawn, then pushing that pawn all the way up the board to where it's not safe doesn't make any sense. It might give you more space, but then eventually if you lose that pawn, the space is lost, and so is the pawn, and so is the material. So that kind of thing can be bad. A lot of times space is really, really good in the opening. If your opponent gives you a lot of space, you should generally take it. Let's take a look at an opening. Let's say white plays e4 and black plays the silly move h6. And white says, good, I'll grab the center with d4. And black says, I'll continue playing silly moves with a6. In this kind of position, I suggest to my students, they might want to move at least a third pawn out. You know, instead of putting your knight on f3 and c3 that way and just developing your pieces, that doesn't give you as much space to take advantage. If we turn on the engine here, you can see that bringing out the knight, the king knight so you can castle, and bringing out the king bishop so you can castle are the second and third best moves. But the number one move is to play c4 and get additional space. You know, getting as many pawns out here, maybe not 8, but getting 4 or 3 or 4, if not 5, when your opponent's doing stuff like this can be very helpful. Let's play that c4 move, and let's continue to make nothing moves for black. Let's say he plays b6. Now the engine wants to play knight c3, and let's do something bad for black like knight to c6. Now the computer says, okay, well now you can keep pushing pawns. You can play d5 and force the knight to the side of the board, or you can play f4 to guard the e5 square. Let's say you play d5 and black plays knight e5. Now, playing your fourth pawn out, f4 is the best move. It doesn't win the knight. The knight can go to g6, and you can't trap it with f5 because he can go back to e5 where you can't attack it anymore. But you could play h4, which is the third best move here, and should be winning for white with proper play. Or you could, again, get the space with f5, knight here, and just develop and hit the knight. And even though he can save it with d6, it's going to be hard for black to develop his pieces here with all those white pawns down the board. Even though the white pawns are all on white, on light squares, and the dark squares are a little weak, it's more than made up for by the tremendous space. The computer says, threaten to trade off that knight. If black now plays knight f3, we get a chance to develop our queen. If black plays bishop to b7, the computer says keep developing with bishop d3. I don't know, let's just make a move for black. Let's say he develops the knight. Computer says hit the knight, he has to take, you take back. And again, black's pieces are all cramped. White is getting ready to castle and have a fantastic game here. So the space in this case is very good. One of the things I tell people is, suppose you go to an open tournament. When I say open, I mean one where there's only one section, and people rated from 500 all the way up to 2,500 are playing in the one section. And they're using regular pairings where the top half is playing the bottom half in the first round, and the 2,500 is paired with like a 1,500, and all the way down to where the 1,600s are playing the 500s. Well, if you're in that and you go around and walk around the tournament hall and look at the games in the opening, just look to see who has more space. There's probably about a 99% chance that the player who has more space is probably the higher rated player, because they're using their pawns in the opening to get spaces and give their pieces more mobility and activity, and the lower rated player is usually kind of cramped a little bit. One of the principles I teach people is when you have closed positions, that is positions that don't have semi-open or open files, which is how the game starts, you generally want to put your pieces behind your pawns instead of in front. Well, you don't know if it's going to be closed on the first couple moves. That's why you would play a move like e4, e5, knight f3. Let's show that. e4, e5, knight f3. That's in front of the pawn. But if we're playing more of a closed opening, let's say we play a symmetric English. You can play your knight to f3. That's a really good move here. But you could also play a Botvinnik attack. And let's say black does play his knight in front, and you play knight ge2 and castle. And this is a Botvinnik attack. h3, why do we play h3? So that if we put the bishop on e3, the knight can't harass it. Let's play a move for black that's not so good. Let's play rook e8. And white plays bishop e3, and let's play another kind of passive move like bishop d7. Now the computer says we should grab more space with f4. And you could see white has more space here the way that white has played it. And also, notice white has all of his pieces behind his pawns. Black has most of his pieces behind his pawns except for the knight on f6, but white does have a slightly bigger than normal advantage. And black tries to get space by playing a break move with b5. And you can see by far the number one move for white, as almost every good player knows here, is to not allow him to do that and push the seventh pawn to a4 to stop black from playing b5 so that black doesn't get the space. If instead white doesn't do that, let's say white just develops a piece with queen d2 and lets black play b5 and get a break move in, then white's space advantage is less than before, and all of a sudden black's army has a lot more activity, and white's advantage here is only about half of what it was if he had played a4. So that's a good example of using space in the opening. Well, we could go over every opening and how space is invited with it, but that would be a separate video. And right now we're just trying to tell you, you're trying to use space so that your pieces have more activity and more mobility. And you're also trying to use space to prevent your opponent from getting activity and mobility. If your space is not doing that, if your space is just creating a bunch of weak squares and then all of a sudden your opponent can poke holes and put their pieces in between, then it's not so good. Let's see if I can come up. Let's look at the chase variation of the Eliakin's defense. So e4, knight f6, d4, knight d5, d4 is the main line. Now, a famous mistake for black here is to play knight c6 and put another piece in front. And now white's winning already. I think there's a famous game, Fine Baratschau, from about almost 100 years ago, where black did play knight c6 and made a mistake, and now white can play c4, knight b6, and then d5 to sack the e-pawn. And after knight takes e5, you simply hit the other knight, which has no good squares to go to. He has to play knight here, and now you play queen to d4, double attacking the knights, and attacking the knight on c4 twice. The only way to save both would be a move like b5, and now you just take en passant, removing that guard. And if black takes back with a pawn, then bishop takes c4 wins a piece. If black takes with a knight, then queen takes e5 wins a piece. And if black does nothing, what could black do to keep guarding that knight? He could play bishop to a6, I guess. And now the computer says white's just up a pawn and he has a pin of that knight on c4. It says play knight d2, and white's pretty much winning a piece again. For instance, knight takes d2, bishop takes a6, and both knights are hit, and one of them is going to be lost. So knight to c6 is a book trap, according to that line. So let's say instead white plays the chase variation. So let's say he plays c4 right away instead of d4, and the knight goes to b6, and now he keeps chasing it, and the knight goes to d5. Well, you could say white has a tremendous amount of space here, and white could keep attacking the knight with a move like bishop c4. But black's just going to play e6 to guard the knight, which can no longer be attacked by a pawn, and black's attacking this pawn on c5. And if white guards it, black can break up the pawns with d6, and all of a sudden white spent all those tempos pushing the pawns up to the 5th rank, and now they're going to get traded off. And when you move a pawn 3 times, let's say you use it a 3rd time to take the pawn, then all of a sudden all those tempos are lost, and a lot of the space is lost, and now black has a perfectly acceptable game. It's not that black is bad here. I mean, not that white is bad. White still has a minor advantage, but he could have had a better advantage than doing this. This also reminds you a little bit of the Alapin variation of the Sicilian. Why am I saying that? Because if we get a Sicilian c3 and black plays the knight f6 variation, we can play e5, and after knight d5 we can play d4. If he takes, we could take back, and if he plays something like e6 we can play bishop c4, and he could play d6, and we get, I think this might be the exact same position we got out of the Eliakin's defense, which also tells you that studying openings from one opening can help you in another opening. I always tell people, if you've never played the French, playing the French defense helps you in a lot of openings because you get positions in some of the irregular lines and other openings, which are similar to French positions. And so if you know how to play the French as black and you're normally playing a Sicilian or something else, a lot of times your French knowledge can help you in that. All right, so today we were talking about space. Again, please tell your friends about my channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And if you like the video, you can do a like. If you would like to subscribe to the channel, that'd be great too. I think we have around 8,000 or 9,000 subscribers, if not more. So I appreciate that, and we will see you next time to help you again. Bye.